a life tough. I saw that film clip of Winston Churchill.
For decades, Charles Bronson was known as the ultimate tough guy of Hollywood, stoic, rugged, and seemingly unshakable. On screen, he was the face of masculinity, an action star who rarely cracked a smile but always commanded respect. Yet behind that hardened image, Bronson carried secrets he never wanted the public to know. And now, whispers from old Hollywood suggest that Bronson's life off-screen was far more complex, filled with hidden passions, forbidden relationships, and connections to actors who were forced to keep their truth locked away. If what's been uncovered is true, it reveals a side of Charles Bronson that completely redefines the man we thought we knew. The Hollywood that Charles Bronson entered in the 1950s was not a forgiving place for those who lived outside the narrow expectations of its studio system. Image was everything. Stars weren't just actors. They were carefully manufactured products, polished and controlled to sell dreams to the public. Men had to appear strong, virile, and unquestionably straight. Any rumor that challenged that image could end a career overnight. For someone like Bronson, who was clawing his way out of poverty and determined to make it in the industry, survival meant playing by Hollywood's rigid rules. But behind closed doors, old Hollywood was a different world. Beneath the glamour and red carpets existed a secret network of relationships, parties, and encounters that the press never saw. Studio heads knew, publicists worked overtime to bury scandals, and stars learned to live double lives. It was in this hidden Hollywood that Charles Bronson is said to have connected with men who, like him, carried burdens too dangerous to reveal. Bronson's early life shaped the way he viewed secrecy. Born into a poor coal mining family, he understood hardship and the need to protect what mattered most. He was the 11th of 15 children and learned toughness as a survival skill. By the time he entered the film industry, he had built an outer shell so strong that no one could easily break through. Yet those who worked closely with him often described a man of surprising vulnerability, quiet, sensitive, and far more complicated than his characters suggested. Rumors began to swirl in the 1960s as Bronson's career gained traction with films like The Magnificent Seven and later The Great Escape. While his co-stars projected a life of glamorous romances with actresses and models, Bronson seemed less willing to play Hollywood's publicity game. He avoided being tied to staged relationships, and his private life remained unusually guarded. To those who watched closely, this secrecy only deepened the mystery. Hollywood insiders whispered that Bronson's connections stretched beyond the roles he played. According to claims that have surfaced in later years, Bronson was linked to several actors who themselves were forced to remain silent about their sexuality. These were men who, like Bronson, projected strength on screen, but carried hidden lives off it. At a time when being openly gay could end a career, these relationships remained carefully hidden in shadows, never acknowledged publicly, and often buried under layers of fear. It's important to understand that Bronson was not alone in this struggle. The studios employed entire teams of fixers to keep such stories from leaking. They arranged marriages of convenience, silenced the press, and redirected attention whenever suspicions grew too loud. Bronson, with his fiercely private nature, fit neatly into this system. He didn't need the spotlight off-screen, and he never courted attention. That allowed him to live with fewer stage distractions. But it also gave rise to endless speculation. By the time Bronson became a household name in the 1970s, with films like Death Wish cementing him as an international icon, he had perfected the art of silence. He spoke little in interviews, kept his personal life off limits, and rarely let anyone glimpse behind the mask. Yet those who knew him quietly suggested there was more to Bronson than audiences ever saw. They hinted at private encounters, friendships that ran deeper than they appeared, and moments of vulnerability that never made it into the public eye. The Hollywood of silence demanded that Charles Bronson keep this part of himself hidden. But as time passed and secrets slipped through cracks, the story of Bronson's private relationships and the men he may have loved began to emerge. And it reveals not only the loneliness of a man trapped by an image, but also the risks he took to find companionship in a world that refused to understand. As the years passed, Charles Bronson's career continued to climb, and with it, The attention on his private life only grew sharper. Yet despite being one of Hollywood's most recognized leading men, Bronson remained an enigma. While other stars were splashed across magazine covers with their glamorous wives or girlfriends, Bronson was often photographed alone, or when with company he appeared distant, as if part of his life remained off-limits to the world. What insiders later whispered was that Bronson had formed deep connections with certain actors, men who, like him, were forced to live behind carefully constructed facades. These bonds were more than just friendships. They carried an intensity that spoke to the risks of the time. Behind closed doors, away from the cameras and studio handlers, Bronson is believed to have shared intimacy with some of Hollywood's most admired figures, men who projected masculine images on screen while concealing private truths. One of the names linked to Bronson has long been speculated but rarely confirmed due to the culture of silence that surrounded old Hollywood. This particular actor, also known for his rugged roles, shared a similar background of hardship and resilience. Like Bronson, he knew the sting of hiding his true self while trying to protect a career built on projecting strength. The two reportedly crossed paths during the 1960s, their professional camaraderie blossoming into something much deeper. According to those familiar with the whispers, their time together was filled with both passion and fear as they constantly navigated the risk of exposure. Hollywood was not a forgiving place for men like them. Gossip columnists thrived on rumors, and any slip could destroy years of hard work. Studios had strict clauses in contracts that demanded stars maintain moral conduct acceptable to the public eye. For Bronson and his companions, this meant leading double lives, smiling for the cameras by day and cautiously seeking connection by night. Those who knew them say it was a constant balancing act, where a single misstep could mean ruin. But these relationships were not just about secrecy. They were about survival. For Bronson, who was known for his stoicism, the ability to share his vulnerabilities with someone who understood must have been a lifeline. The men he was rumored to be involved with carried the same weight of expectations, the same loneliness of being unable to fully reveal themselves. In one another they found empathy, understanding, and a rare sense of freedom, if only in the privacy of a locked room or secluded getaway. There are stories of private gatherings where actors like Bronson could momentarily shed their public masks. These were not the glitzy Hollywood parties filled with champagne and flashing cameras, but smaller, intimate spaces where trust was the unspoken rule. In these rare moments, Bronson could be himself, no longer the tough guy etched into the public's imagination, but a man yearning for connection. Friends of those circles have since suggested that Bronson's bonds with certain actors were more enduring than casual encounters. They were relationships, albeit ones hidden in shadow. Despite the secrecy, traces of these bonds sometimes slipped through. Observant fans noted the way Bronson carried himself around certain co-stars, the quiet glances, the subtle ease of his body language, and the depth of his loyalty. Bronson was not known for being warm or openly affectionate in public. Yet those who worked on set occasionally remarked that he shared a special closeness with certain male colleagues, a closeness that felt different from standard Hollywood camaraderie. In the end, what makes these rumored relationships so significant is not the shock value of who was involved, but the reality of what they endured. To live authentically in old Hollywood was nearly impossible. Bronson's hidden bonds reflect the struggle of countless men and women who were forced to mask their truth, sacrificing openness for survival. And for Charles Bronson, those connections, though never publicly acknowledged, may have been some of the most meaningful in his life. By the 1970s, Charles Bronson was no longer just another actor. He was one of Hollywood's biggest international stars. His roles in films like Death Wish and The Mechanic cemented him as the embodiment of the rugged, unflinching tough guy. Audiences around the world admired his grit and intensity, but the image came with a cost. The tougher Bronson appeared on screen, the harder it became to show the world who he truly was. Living in the spotlight meant Bronson had to maintain a flawless facade. And with every box office success, the pressure to keep his secrets buried only intensified. Old Hollywood was built on illusions, and Bronson's masculinity was one of the studio's most profitable brands. If whispers of his private life had ever become front-page scandals, it could have destroyed the career he had worked so hard to build. For that reason, he perfected the art of silence. But silence does not come without weight. Friends and close colleagues often described Bronson as guarded, even cold at times, but beneath that exterior lay a man who struggled deeply with isolation. Rumors of his hidden relationships with other male actors persisted behind closed doors, and Bronson was more than just a lover or confidant. He was a protector, ensuring that no word of their connection would ever slip beyond trusted walls. The irony was undeniable. On screen, Bronson's characters often carried guns, fought enemies, and stood tall in the face of danger. Off-screen, his battles were of a different kind. Emotional wars waged quietly in the dead of night. The silence he lived with was its own form of violence, cutting him off from the possibility of living openly. And yet he endured, because the alternative meant professional and personal ruin. Some who worked with him believed this hidden struggle shaped his performances. His characters were often stoic men weighed down by invisible burdens. Men who spoke little but whose eyes revealed oceans of unspoken pain. Perhaps this wasn't just acting. Perhaps Bronson was channeling his own experience, the sorrow of having to live a half-truth, the longing for a freedom that never came. What makes Bronson's story especially haunting is how many others shared his plight. He was not alone. Old Hollywood was filled with men and women forced to keep secrets. But for Bronson, whose entire brand rested on being the most masculine of men, the stakes were even higher. To reveal himself, even in part, would have been to shatter the illusion that made him famous. And so he carried the weight of silence, year after year, while quietly building bonds that gave him fleeting glimpses of peace. In the end, Bronson's silence was both his shield and his prison. It kept him safe from scandal, but it also denied him the possibility of openly embracing the people who mattered most to him. The very toughness that audiences adored was, in reality, a mask, one that hid a man longing for acceptance, but too afraid to reach for it. As Charles Bronson aged, the intensity of his career began to fade, but the weight of his hidden life never truly disappeared. By the 1980s and 1990s, he was no longer the unstoppable box office force he had once been, yet he remained an icon of masculinity. To the world, he was still the tough, silent man who had defined an entire era of action films. But behind closed doors, those who knew him best sensed a quieter vulnerability in his later years, a man reflecting on a lifetime of battles, both public and private. Bronson rarely gave interviews. And when he did, he was famously guarded, offering little more than a few words about his work. Yet some of his closest confidants hinted that in private conversations, he was less rigid, more open, especially when reflecting on the relationships he had cherished but could never acknowledge. These were not confessions made for scandal or attention. They were the words of a man looking back at the cost of silence. The names of the men he was linked to never fully reached the public, but whispers persisted long after his passing. Some say he had deep connections with at least two actors who, like him, were celebrated for their rugged personas, but privately lived with the same burden of secrecy. For Bronson, those relationships were not mere flings. They were the closest thing he had to real intimacy in a world where authenticity was forbidden. What is most telling is how his body of work reflected the man behind the mask. Bronson's characters were almost always loners, isolated, burdened, and misunderstood. They fought their battles alone, with little room for vulnerability. In hindsight, it is difficult not to see the parallels between these roles and Bronson's real life. His art may have been the only place where he could safely express the emotions he was forced to suppress in reality. By the time Bronson's health began to decline, Hollywood itself had started to change. The industry was slowly becoming more open, more willing to embrace truth over image. But for Bronson, that change came too late. He had lived most of his life under a code of silence, and those habits were impossible to undo. While others began speaking openly about their identities, Bronson remained a man of his generation, loyal to his secrets until the very end. And yet, The truth has a way of surviving even when it's unspoken. Those who were close to him, who shared in his most private moments, have kept his memory alive, not just as an actor, but as a man who longed for something more than fame and fortune. They speak of his tenderness, his quiet humor, and his fierce loyalty, qualities the public rarely saw, but which defined him in private. The legacy of Charles Bronson, then, is not only about the films he left behind, but also about the hidden story of resilience and sacrifice that so many in old Hollywood endured. He was one of countless men forced to live a life split in two: the man the cameras adored and the man who existed in the shadows. His silence protected him, but it also robbed him of the freedom to fully embrace love without fear. In the end, the secrets Bronson carried with him were not just his own. They were a reflection of an entire era of Hollywood built on illusion. Today, as society looks back with greater empathy, his story serves as a reminder of the human cost of hiding one's truth. Beneath the hard-edged image of Charles Bronson was a man who loved, who longed, and who carried those loves quietly to his grave.